somebody laughing at me? I think we should start, although one is always optimistic that since it's Friday night, that people will continue to wander in as they escape from the pub or wherever they are. Here's somebody, see? Told you. So I'll do my introduction really, really slowly, hoping the hall will fill up. I've been asked to chair this event. I am a professor of sociology and chair of the sociology department here at Regina, and also until the end of the month a trustee on the Regina Public School Board. Can you hear me okay? No? Well, maybe I'll use the podium mic. Okay, I hear you. What I just said is not particularly relevant anyway, so I'll go on from there. The topic tonight is the relevance of the Regina Manifesto in the 21st century, a topic that is most timely. Turn off. I did turn it off.
It's that 20th century technology.
We are suffering sabotage. Most timely, relevant, and extremely important in this day. Last night I was at an all-candidates forum for Ward 3 and 6 candidates for the City Council. And during the discussion I used a term that seemed to resonate a bit with the audience. I talked about the fact that we appear to be living in a business dictatorship. The business agenda dominates our politics at all three levels of government. And of course, this is a democratic dictatorship, and I'm not being inspired here by Lenin, but it is a democratic dictatorship which we, the people, have allowed to occur, and which could end abruptly in a pivotal election. But it nevertheless remains a dictatorship. One phrase I used that particularly resonated was that here in Regina we have a government of the Chamber of Commerce, for the Chamber of Commerce, and by the Chamber of Commerce. And people seem to think that made quite a bit of sense. The fact, of course, is, as we all know, the powerful business lobby across this country and around the world sets the agenda, and governments implement it with little debate. And every time I think of that, I recall those history books where I read about, especially Naylor's History of Canadian Business, where I read about John A. Macdonald and how he used to get annual briefs from the Canadian Manufacturers Association which listed all the tariffs they wanted to be imposed. And he would accept the list from them, and then he would call in the bureaucrats of the civil service and, like Captain Kirk, say, "Make it so." And they would go off and write the legislation which would be duly passed. And of course we thought we had made some progress since John A., but we seem to be returning to those days. It of course has been a gradual process. It's incomplete, it's uneasy, because we do live, after all, in a constitutional democracy. And the people who represent the business lobby and hold the offices have to get re-elected from time to time. But we all know what we've been living through, what has variously been called a neoliberal, neoconservative counter-revolution, inspired by Reagan, Thatcher, Mulroney, Bennett the Younger, of course, who was one of the early pioneers who died on his own sword over it, Devine and others. The list of scoundrels is long and growing, and we all know, too, this list came to include NDP premiers and NDP federal leaders, as they too were swept away in the neoliberal debt hysteria. We all know in retrospect particularly, but even at the time many of us said, what is happening here is an effort to roll back the gains, the popular gains that have been made since the 1930s, and to switch the relations of power in terms of distribution of wealth so that more and more goes to capital of the wealth produced, and less goes to wages, salaries, and social programs. I have a friend at King's College in London, Ontario, who has been working on the concept of deep politics. And I think we could apply that concept quite easily to what's happening here in Canada and around the world. The real ruling class of this country, and this isn't news for many of us, of course, is the Canadian Council of Chief Executives, the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, the Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters Association, the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. Those are the dominant figures who set the political agenda for the country. And then, of course, we have all the support system they have in place, the business-oriented right-wing think tanks, C.D. Howe, Fraser, the Conference Board, the Canada West Foundation, the Institute for Business and Research on Public Policy, Institute for Strategic Studies, the Institute for Economic Policy. These groups keep growing, and there are more and more of them. I don't have time to go through the full list. I urge you to read Jamie Brownlee's book, Ruling Canada, to get it. And of course, Bill Carroll's latest book. These groups are well-funded, well-financed, extremely powerful, and extremely effective. I think what happened was in the neoconservative, neoliberal revolution, the right learned how to do politics. And I think they learned that, from having to deal with what happened in the 60s and the emergence of the New Left and the popular upsurgence. They became much more politically effective. We all know, too, the turning point was the 1988 free trade election. This was, of course, the end of effective democracy in this country and the final triumph of the business dictatorship. Now, what is the relevance of the Regina Manifesto in all this? For me, the relevance is not so much the document itself and what it actually says about the era in which it was written, but it does remind us of the power of democracy, the potential power of democracy, that an active and aroused citizenry with a clear objective, with a clear sense of the remedies necessary, with a clear, more reasonably clear understanding of the power of the enemies of progressive change, with also an understanding that state power in a democratic society must be won and must be used for popular objectives with some courage and determination. It reminds us, too, that we as citizens can sit down together, rationally diagnose our problems, their causes, and develop what we consider to be effective remedies based on our experience. And we also understand that these remedies can be fought for, and if power is won, implemented against powerful interests if we have the courage and determination. We live in a time, of course, when Canadians have lost faith in their democracy and need to be reminded that their, I suppose one could say, collective democratic power is really the only power, I shouldn't say we have as a citizenry. It's the only power that the people have ever had, and they have had it only imperfectly through long years of struggle to obtain it. It is this power alone which we can use to offset the established power groups which control the economy and therefore control our society and lives. I'm almost embarrassed to do this, but I'll do it. In a phrase made popular recently south of the border, the manifesto said, "Yes, you can." And they said it against the many naysayers. And Canadians today need to come together and say as well, yes, we can. And perhaps we can see a rebirth of effective popular democracy. Well, we're here tonight for a talk organized by the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. And I think we should remember the list of the powerful think tanks that exist purveying the business lobby's agenda and version of things, policies that should be implemented, and so on. And understand that there are very few think tanks, policy centers that stand in opposition to them. They don't have a lot of funding. They are often marginal in their funding. There's obviously the CCPA, which is probably the most important and prominent think tank because it is in Ottawa and it is reasonably well funded by donations from all of us and various trade unions. But of course there are all the smaller ones, the Social Research Unit, the Community Research Unit here at the U of R, many universities, the Institute in Alberta, what's it called there? Parkland. There's here and there's efforts to put together alternative policy institutes and think tanks to counter this incredible hegemony that's been imposed on our politics. So the CCPA needs your support. So I'm asking you to think about purchasing a membership in the CCPA. You can get a basic membership for $35 a year, but they'll take as much as you can give them. And of course, the CCPA has put this event on free of charge. There were no tickets and so on. But it has cost some money to bring the speakers here and to host this event. So volunteers will be passing around to collect donations to help cover the costs. And so try and give generously. I've also been asked as chair of the event to thank the sponsors of this event. Obviously, there's the host organizations, I should say, the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives Saskatchewan office and the Faculty of Social Work's Social Policy Research Unit, as well as the Saskatchewan Federation of Labour, the Canadian Labour Congress, Grain Services Union, and the Canadian Union Public Employees Saskatchewan Division. Each speaker tonight will be taking about 30 minutes, and there will be time at the end for remarks, for questions, comments from the floor. I hope not long-winded speeches. Do not take my introduction tonight as the model and example. But hopefully there'll be some degree of free-ranging discussion. The mics are on the floor. They're alive. Don't use them yet. They're also not wired. What do you call those kind of mics? Wireless, yes. They're wireless mics. You can move around. But if you do move around as you talk, then please return them to the stand. The two speeches will form the final chapter of the book that's being written by Lynn Goodlick, who is the former director of the Saskatchewan office of the CCPA and is writing on the Regina Manifesto. Her book is entitled The Regina Manifesto and a New Beginning for Social Democracy in Canada and is nearing completion and is due out by the CCPA in the spring of 2010. Our first speaker tonight is Murray Dobbin. Murray Dobbin is now based in Powell River, BC. You all probably have heard of him, and many of you know him. He's been a journalist, a broadcaster, an author, a social activist for over 40 years. An executive board member and research associate with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. He's written 5 studies for the Centre, including an expose of charter schools and 10 myths about the Canadian tax system. He's been a columnist for the Financial Post. My God, how did you pull that one out? And Winnipeg Free Press, contributes guest editorials to the Globe and Mail and other Canadian dailies, and writes a column for the Vancouver online paper, The Tyee, and of course for Rabble.ca. He has also prepared several radio documentaries for the CBC's Radio's Ideas series on subjects including taxes, human rights, the free market reforms in New Zealand. He's written 5 books, 3 of them critical profiles of Canadian politicians. His last book, Paul Martin, CEO for Canada, ? Does it have the question mark in the title? Why does it have Was that really a question? Anyway, he looked at Martin's corporate approach to running the country. His 1988 book, The Myth of the Good Corporate Citizen, Democracy Under the Rule of Big Business, has been described as a citizen's guide to globalization. Murray's been involved in many social movements over the years and is a past executive board member of the Council of Canadians. He's a senior advisor with the Rideau Institute on International Affairs. He's also well known as a public speaker, addressing union and NGO conventions and educational conferences. In recent years, he focused on the Bay Street initiative called the Security and Prosperity Partnership and on the threat to public services posed by public-private partnerships. More recently, he's been examining the concept of prosperity without growth as a response to the economic and climate crisis. Now, I introduced both speakers, and then we'll just get on with it. So I'll go through the introduction to Armine. Armine Yalnizyan is the senior economist with the National CCPA office. She joined in 2008 to advance the work of the Growing Gap project. She's a longtime research associate. She has participated in the alternative federal budget since its launch in 1994. She has tracked trends in labor markets, income distribution, government budgets, and access to services, particularly training and health care, for over 20 years. And I must say I have to thank her because she's been enabled me to develop some rather brilliant and learned lectures based on her work, which I duly recognize as I give them, of course. In 1998, she authored a groundbreaking report on income inequality in Canada entitled The Growing Gap, published by the Centre for Social Justice. In 2000, her follow-up report documented the driving forces behind trends in income inequality province by province. Armine was honored as the first Atkinson Foundation Economic Justice Fellow in 2002 and received the Morley Gunderson Prize in 2003 from the University of Toronto, where she obtained her Master's in Industrial Relations. She serves on the boards of the Institute of Population and Public Health, the Public Interest Advocacy Centre, and the Canadian Association for Business Economics. She also sits on the Research Advisory Committee of Social Planning Toronto, where she was a program director from 87 to 97 and director of research in 2006-2007. Armine is also a founding member of the Progressive Economics Forum and has had the opportunity to work with local government and community-based groups to develop community audit techniques. These tools help communities assess the strengths and limits of the voluntary sector and the capacity of neighborhoods to adapt to profound changes in government provisions. So we obviously have two very experienced, knowledgeable people here, and they will be talking to you for 30 minutes on the relevance of the manifesto. I think the topic was left wide open to them. And once they're finished, we'll open up the floor. Murray, the floor is yours.
Thank you, John. We were just reminiscing about, John used to be the host of my open line show back in the 70s called Counterpoint. The good old days when you could get something progressive on the CBC. Anyway, it's good to be here. In the birthplace of Canadian social democracy, especially celebrating the 76th anniversary of the Regina Manifesto. It would be better if the province wasn't now dominated by reform conservatives, both provincially and federally, but we just have to take what we get. So Armine and I were asked to comment on the future of social democracy in Canada, in part by looking back at the Regina Manifesto. And of course, it's an amazing document. I had a little, one of these little pocket ones, and of course, because it's small, I couldn't find it. I filed it away somewhere, but it's all over the internet anyway. You can download it if you didn't know that. So it's still an amazing document, and I'm looking forward to Lynn's book, which will obviously, put it in historical context as well. And there's lots of quotes that I could use from it, but I thought here's one that I liked. With the question of, is it relevant? We aim to replace the present capitalist system with its inherent injustice and humanity. It's a good start. By a social order from which domination and exploitation of one class by another will be eliminated, in which economic planning will supersede unregulated private enterprise and competition, and in which genuine democratic self-government based on economic equality will be possible. The present order is marked by glaring inequalities of wealth and opportunity, by chaotic waste and instability, and in an age of plenty it condemns the great mass of people to poverty and insecurity. Power has become more and more concentrated into the hands of a small, irresponsible minority of financiers and industrialists, and to their predatory interests, the majority are habitually sacrificed. I'd say it's relevant. This is sort of like Back to the Future. We went up, we got a little better, now we're back to where they were when they wrote this document. So I just wanted to go through quickly some of the elements of the manifesto. One of the first parts is planning, the establishment of a planned socialized economic order in order to make possible the most efficient development of national resources and the most equitable distribution of national income. Article 5 talks about external trade and the idea of managed trade, which of course what the Auto Pact was, rather than free trade. Talk about a labor code in which we'd actually see a reduction in the number of working hours. We now have, I think, 25% of Canadian workers now work over 50 hours a week. So we're clearly going, those who are still working, obviously. So we're going backwards on that. Interesting, one of the more interesting articles in the manifesto was the BNA Act, and they talked about having to make constitutional change because the federal government, the provincial governments had jurisdiction over the most important programs like education and social welfare and health care. So that was an interesting, I don't know if anyone would try that now, but it was clear that they were looking at the national government as a key player in terms of accomplishing the things that they talked about. And of course, under external relations, should be a foreign policy designed to obtain international economic cooperation and to promote disarmament and world peace. So, taxation and public finance, very strong principles again. Now, obviously, 76 years later, there's things that the CCF, that the drafters of the manifesto couldn't have anticipated. The climate change crisis, obviously, is one. The finite nature of natural resources were not on people's minds when you were trying to, develop an economy that could provide people with the basic living standards. Peak oil is another one. They weren't thinking of that either. And certainly corporate globalization and the resulting deindustrialization of developed nations removes a lot of the production of goods and services that social democratic government might want to try and regulate. And what I find really interesting in this document too, in a couple of places they talk about, they put a lot of faith in a progressive, highly educated civil service, which is really interesting because they in fact did develop the best civil service probably ever in North America. The one thing that I can't remember anyone writing about this, but when Ross Thatcher came to power in Saskatchewan, he basically got rid of all the progressive civil service, especially at the deputy minister level, and they all went to Ottawa just in time to get Medicare in the federal government. So the fabulous civil service that had built Saskatchewan from 1944 till 1964 moved to Ottawa, and with the Pearson government and then Trudeau government, where we managed to get a few things as well. And of course, the other thing they couldn't have imagined in 1933 was the kind of rampant consumerism and the advent of manipulative advertising and marketing that has basically turned into a way of life. Consumerism is sort of in my view anyway, one of the great enemies of equality and certainly the environment. So those are details. That's a new historical context, obviously, but the principles of the Regina Manifesto remain as relevant today as they were in 1933. An economy that is planned in the public interest for economic democracy, fair trade, protection for workers, and a strong social safety net, foreign policy rooted in peace and mutual respect amongst nations, the subjection of private capital to the public good, and genuine democracy, civil rights, civil liberties, and human rights. So, what is the future of social democracy in Canada? It's an odd role, given that I've always been critical of social democracy. And called myself a socialist, but I have to confess I haven't had a really good conversation about what socialism is for a very long time. So we'll take a whack at social democracy. So I was trying to figure out how to do this. So I developed a 9-step program for recovering social democrats. So this is my 9-step program. I'm sure there's 10. I couldn't think of a 10th one. Someone will do that. Anyway, step 1, and I think this is by far the largest and most difficult for conventional social democrats to grapple with, and that is that we have to address the unrestricted, rampant consumerism that capitalism is based on. It's unsustainable, it's destructive of the environment and society. It doesn't even make people happy. It's the key to this kind of growth is the key to the survival of capitalism. So if you want to get rid of capitalism, you have to starve it to death. You have to stop it from growing. And that's why we need essentially and this is always something social democracy would have trouble with, is revolution, but we're talking about a cultural revolution in terms of consumerism and what we spend our money on. If we can't do this, whether it's social democrats or whoever, if we can't get off this train, then we will with certainty be doomed to live through a hideous dystopia and the end of our species. So it's good, we might as well start now. Step 2. So part of this policy response to the triple threat of climate crisis, economic crisis, and peak oil is the concept of prosperity without growth. That is to say, a sort of a slow growth economy. Again, nothing weakens capital's death grip on the planet more than planned, deliberate, slower growth. And there's no better time to develop a serious challenge to finance capitalism and so-called free trade. So social democracy has to embrace the ideas of slow growth or prosperity without growth. And what is that? I mean, I'm not an expert on this. I'm just delving into it myself. But visit a site if you're interested. It's actually done by the British government, which amazed me. It's called the Sustainable Development Commission, and it has quite an interesting collection of essays and stuff. But I mean, some of the principles are tackling inequality, removing incentives for status competition, sharing available work, decreasing work hours, obviously, focusing attention on work-life balance, measures to reverse the whole obsession with consumerism, reducing the dependence on private sector economic activity, policies that promote a sense of community, conviviality, and collective health, the promotion of effective active citizenship, and active promotion of non-materialism. The third step to recovery. To imagine this kind of economic and social and cultural future, you have to imagine a different kind of state. And there's been some work done on this over the years, not enough. But it has to go beyond the Regina Manifesto's faith in a progressive, highly professional civil service. So the new social democratic state has to be radically democratic in the sense that, well, we can take lessons from the participatory budgeting of Porto Alegre in Brazil, but it needs to go further than that. In Sweden, for example, the government actually provides resources, documentation, financial resources for thousands of neighborhood groups that get together and talk about democracy, and they become more effective citizens. We need to restructure policymaking in the sense of involving people on social assistance in the making of social welfare policy, involving patients and nurses in the making of health policy. I mean, it's all very well to have a progressive professional civil service, but they can always be fired and replaced by trainees from the Fraser Institute. But if you root policy making in the community and make the community responsible for it, it's a lot harder to get rid of. Step 4, social democracy must focus on rebuilding the domestic economy and wean itself from its dependence on trade with the United States, a collapsing empire, and soon to be an economic basket case if it isn't already. Tying yourself to the American economy is like holding on to a 100-pound weight and trying to walk on water. It's not going to work. We need to, or social democracy needs to reverse the whole series of policies that had the euphemism of labor flexibility. I love these. I love they're very good at framing, right? Who could be opposed to flexibility? Anyway, the labor flexibility policies were the ones that cut unemployment insurance and cut welfare. Paul Martin created a deliberate recession throughout most of the 1990s to drive down wages and labor power. So we need to eliminate those policies and have a policy of actually having high wages rather than low wages. At the end of this process, by the way, Canada had the second highest number of low wage jobs in the world. So it was a very successful project, and done, justified by the free trade agreement, by saying we have to be competitive with the United States. The other thing that needs to be done is we need to reintroduce industrial development policies, which were virtually eliminated by the Paul Martin government in the mid-90s, to look at a green economy, conservation, public pharmacare, all kinds of things that an industrial policy could do to look into the future, rather than just leaving it in the hands of hedge funds and currency speculators. Step 5, a massive increase in public investment and social spending. So social democracy really has to be bold in declaring that the private sector has failed completely to meet the needs of the vast majority of Canadians. Its investment record is appalling. Essentially a casino economy. The export of our best jobs, selling out to foreign corporations. So we need to massively invest in infrastructure, crown corporations, energy, pharmaceuticals, all kinds of examples could be thought of. But also in childcare, home care, pharmacare. We should have free tuition at universities, and we could actually afford to do that. The huge increase in public investment does two things. One, it meets the needs of Canadians, but secondly, it removes much of the space that is now occupied by private capital and reduces their power and influence. So, there's two ways to challenge capitalism. One is to starve it, the other is to tax it to death. And that's number 6, is if we're going to have a return to serious public investment, both in terms of infrastructure and public ownership of resources and social programs, then we have to return to a fair tax regime and a robust tax base. I'm not sure if people realize just how much money we have lost under Paul Martin and Jim Flaherty in terms of their tax cuts. Martin, it's interesting, when Martin has this reputation of being the guy who slayed the deficit. But it's interesting if you read his 1995 budget speech. What he said he was proud of was taking spending back to the same level that it was in 1950. Something, I think it was from like 18% down to 15%, I can't remember, 12. So this is what he was proud of. He didn't care about the deficit. He used the deficit. It was what Naomi Klein would call it, sort of a useful crisis. It was a great opportunity to drive spending down as far as you possibly could. So Paul Martin introduced in 2000, after he'd cut 40% from social spending in 95 to 97, in the year 2000, the economy finally grew, and he had all this money. So he gave a $100 billion tax cut over 5 years to the wealthy and to corporations. And then Jim Flaherty, in 2006-2007, gave a $60 billion tax cut over 5 years, still being implemented, although nobody talks about it very much. If you just look at Flaherty's tax cuts, it's reduced our federal spending for the year 2008-2009 by $30 billion. Imagine what you could do with that over a period of time, every year, if you had that $30 billion. I mean, I think the national child care program was $6 billion. So you could do a child care program, you could do a home care program, you could get started on a national pharmaceutical program. If you included the cuts that Paul Martin made along with the ones that Flaherty made, you're probably looking at something like $60 billion a year in lost revenue. Number 7, we need to slash military spending. Again, this is an issue that hardly ever gets into the media. This year we spent, we'll spend $21 billion on the military. It's the largest budget since the Second World War. It's 15% more than at the height of the Cold War. The Harper's Canada First defense strategy will see increases of 3% every year until 2027. God, I'm glad he won't be around for that long, but if he was, it would be $31 billion that year. And the total for that 20-year period would be $440 billion. So we need to get that money back. Step 8 for the recovering social democrat. We have to address climate change in a serious way. Now, I'm not an expert on carbon taxes or cap and trade, but I have a real affection for enforcing the law. I mean, I think we need to go back to a time when you fined corporations for breaking the law. You know, we put people in jail for stealing a pound of hamburger. We could surely, implement fines against corporations that actually break the law. And, fines that mean something. So you have a forensic accountant figuring out how much that particular breaking of the law made the company and fine them 100 times as much. I mean, that would get their attention. We haven't done that for a very long time. Ninth and last step, for social democracy to renew itself, it must do politics differently. And, I mean, there's a number of things. I mean, they need to really push hard for proportional representation, which I think is an important sort of mechanism of democracy. But I think that the biggest weakness of social democracy in this country is the enormous gap between extra-parliamentary social movement politics and party politics. And it has always been that way. And it's something we haven't solved yet, and it's something we have to solve. I remember interviewing Roy Romano for Briar Patch magazine before he became leader. And I asked him to comment on the role of extra-parliamentary politics. And Roy said, and I quote, "Extra-parliamentary politics is completely useless." Thanks, Roy. So, now there was an organization that lasted for, a year and a half, called the New Politics Initiative, and Don Mitchell was part of that, and I don't know if anyone else knew who it was, but it was aimed at trying to do exactly this. The New Politics Initiative was really designed to do two things. One, to sort of remake the NDP in the image of its CCF predecessor. That is to say that it would not just be an electoral machine, that it would be a movement party, that you would begin to see grassroots political activity between elections, at the constituency level. And of course, the CCF came out of social movements. That didn't have to, solve that problem. That's the roots of the CCF. And the second thing was to bridge that gap between social movement politics and party politics. And actually, we should have kept going. It was a real mistake, actually, to drop it. But we essentially disbanded after Jack Layton got elected, because Jack actually seemed to get it. He understood the connection and talked a fairly good game. And he hired someone who was a coordinator, a sort of liaison between social movement organizations and the party, and kept him on for a year. It turns out that it was the social movements that were the problem, not the party. You had organizations like the Council of Canadians, which is a really excellent organization in terms of the work it does, but almost pathologically nonpartisan. And Canada's somewhat unique in this. I mean, if you look at Latin America, if you look at Europe, there is not this sort of bizarre division between the two branches of progressive politics. All kinds of organizations endorse parties in elections, and if they don't do what they said they're going to do, they don't endorse them the next time. It's not rocket science. But in this country, it's incredibly difficult. On the parliamentary side, I mean, I've had Saskatchewan actually worse than BC, but I've had long-time NDP members come up to me and basically just berate me for not getting out of my social movement stuff and just joining the party. Like, get with the program. And of course, on our side, my side, the social movement side, we have a kind of crude understanding of the nature of political power. And so the elections have nothing to do with us. And if the NDP happens to get elected, if they do good stuff, we don't say anything because that's what they're supposed to do. And if they do bad stuff, they're a bunch of bastards. I mean, that's how sophisticated we are in this country in terms of the relationship between extra-parliamentary politics and political party. If we don't solve this problem, we'll never solve it. So, I mean, this is a huge problem for progressive politics in Canada, and I think we need to try and address it again. I mean, all of these 9 steps are critical, but I think the last one, the first one is the most difficult and the last one is the most critical. So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you.
Hey gang, you really know how to live it up on a Friday night, eh? Okay, so my turn at the mic, and I'm going to read from a text because I didn't want to blow this. When I was first asked to address this group, to come out to support the Saskatchewan CCPA, which is awesome, I told Simon I'd be glad to, but please don't ask me to talk about the manifesto, Simon. I know nothing about it. I haven't read it. And he cheerfully told me, well, that's kind of the point of the evening. You know, we're here to talk about the relevance of what happened in 1933 in the light of what is unfolding around us these days. And so I said, okay, I'm game, you know, want to support you guys. Let's take a look. And like my good friend Murray said, I opened it up. I've never read it before. I opened it up, and the first line is, we aim to replace the present capitalist system. And I thought, oh boy. Like, maybe with you guys that like goes over like water off your backs, but I'm thinking like for the most part of what's happening in Canadian politics these days, in terms of the mainstream, not a lot of people out there that are saying what we need to do is like recreate capitalism in Canada or even in Saskatchewan. And as Murray did, I'm going to repeat the opening paragraph in its entirety because it was like a showstopper for me. Okay, we aim to replace the present capitalist system, well, with its inherent injustice and inhumanity, we can all go with that, by a social order from which the domination and exploitation of one class by another will be eliminated, in which economic planning will supersede unregulated private enterprise and competition, in which genuine democratic self-government based on economic equality will be possible. I says to myself, how is this relevant for today? Not many people you know that talk about wanting to get rid of capitalism or talk about moving to a classless society or closing the door on competition or achieving a government of the people, all of the people, by the people, for the people. You know, it just doesn't seem resonant. It doesn't seem doable. It just seems like completely out of touch with our current context. And it gets better. So the very next paragraph shifts from a very pragmatic tone of what must be done, we've just heard these pragmatic tones, to a fairly feisty indignance about why it must be done. And I will quote, as Murray did, but I want to say it again with feeling, because you got to hear these words. The present order is marked by glaring inequalities of wealth, of opportunity, by chaotic waste and instability. In an age of plenty, it condemns the great mass of people to poverty and insecurity. Power has become more and more concentrated in the hands of a small, irresponsible minority of financiers and industrialists, and to their predatory interests, the majority are habitually sacrificed. Okay, that one blew me away, because this second passage from a socialist tract written in 1933, it could have been written last week. Very few people would raise an eyebrow if you read it in the newspapers these days. It is typical reading fare in the U.S. dailies, and only slightly less common here. So this evening, I have been asked to speak about three things. Is the manifesto relevant today? Where did progressive politics go anyway? And what have we learned? And then together, after I'm done, we're going to discuss where we go from here. But before I start, I just want to start off with this. I want to thank the CCPA for convening this gathering, because it is all too easy to sleepwalk. Much harder is it to wake up. And this evening I hope will wake us up a little bit, help us work towards something more than the status quo, because the status quo today, just like it was in the 1930s, just didn't cut it. It didn't work for women today or in the 1930s. It didn't work for young families, for immigrants, for people of color, for our Aboriginal brothers and sisters, and it's not working for the planet. It is certainly not working for more stable geopolitics. So it's time to get to the real work of addressing not just the fallout from the crisis, but what went terribly, terribly wrong as we all got sucked up in the pursuit of gunning for a booming economy. So just how relevant is the Regina Manifesto to the changes that need to happen today? Well, I don't know when the phrase expose, oppose, propose was first coined. I first heard it in 1994. It came from the lips of a very refined and elegant elderly gentleman, Gerald van der Zand, a Dutchman who for decades was the Canadian face of the faith-based Citizens for Public Justice. Expose, oppose, propose. In something like 5,000 words, that's exactly what the manifesto accomplishes. It offers a pithy critique of capitalism, a critique of politics, and a critique of public policy, the three fundamentals that shape your life and my life each and every day. And it didn't miss a beat in proposing pragmatic steps that would correct the blockages to meaningful prosperity for us all. At the heart of this diagnosis and prescription is confidence and faith. Yes, I mean faith that we can do better. And that the test of doing better is that no one is left behind in our pilgrimage towards the abundant life. Now, I'm using religious words, because by the abundant life, I do not mean abundant stuff. I mean the stuff of life, and that's what the folks at the Regina Manifesto meant, too. Freedom from fear and violence, freedom to develop one's full potential. Well, without question, we've got more stuff than our predecessors did a generation ago. But, you know, that's just about it. As a society, hey, we settled. We settled for so little of enduring value from this period of extraordinary growth that we've just gone through. And in the process, we privatized the very notion of prosperity. We now consider vast excess at the top quite normal. We've grown accustomed to hearing that access to the basics like housing, education, saving for retirement or a rainy day, that's increasingly difficult to attain, not just for the poorest amongst us, but for the many amongst us. Scarcity in the midst of excess is no longer news. But as we're learning, these kind of imbalances will not last forever because rising inequality, in good times and bad, which is what we've just seen in the last generation, that's not sustainable economically, it's not sustainable ecologically, and it is definitely not sustainable politically. The growing gap, my friends, is yet another inconvenient truth of our era, every bit as threatening to our health, our economy, and our future as climate change, as it was 75 years ago. So I will urge you, as Murray did, like me a few weeks ago, if you have not read the manifesto yet, do so, because perhaps its most startling revelation is just how much of this radical shopping list of must-dos got done. So my first job here is to tell you what the gains were that were made. And I want you to remember that none of the things I'm about to say that you might take for granted today existed at the time of these folks getting together to write up the manifesto. Some of the things that they demanded took decades to achieve. Others, like emergency measures to put people to work or establishing a Bank of Canada, that was a matter of months after they wrote the manifesto, because there was already a good deal of consensus of what needed doing, and fast. So let me start from the list of 26 things that we didn't have in 1933 that we have today. A Bank of Canada. A Bank of Canada that controls prices and to some extent credit and regulates foreign exchange, even when it moved from a fixed gold standard to floating exchange rates. We didn't have that. Securities regulators. Okay, they're not national, which is what these folks wanted, but they are increasingly unwilling to regulate, but we do have the infrastructure for regulating securities. Marketing boards. Security of tenure for agricultural producers, which at the time was the biggest industry in the country. A breakdown of protectionism and opening up to trade. Cooperative approaches to attain economies of scale and risk pooling without sacrificing a person's independence and autonomy. Now that was more on the producer's side than on the consumer's side, but both were encouraged. Greater productivity. That's what they wanted. They wanted greater productivity and utilization of the factors of production in agriculture. Because, hey, who wants to work more than you have to? Public ownership of electrical utilities, telecommunications, public transit, and most roadways. That was a pipe dream in 1933. Today, it's in the process of being privatized again. Medicare. 1933, they're calling for Medicare. We got it. Unemployment insurance benefits. Well, now they're weaker than they were at any time since the 1940s when they were first introduced. but it is possible to fix it. We do have that system, and it's because of these folks. Income supports for the elderly, disabled, injured workers, check, check, check. Workers' health and safety boards, check. Wage and insurance benefits, which vary from family size, vary with family size, absolutely right on. And we had that even in unemployment insurance benefits until the 1970s, and we still have that for social assistance and children's benefits. Limitations and reductions in the hours of work, check. The right to associate as workers with common interests to protect themselves in countervailing power against the strength of their bosses, check. Leading to the ascendance of trade unionism. And they asked specifically for the right to associate amongst public sector workers. Guess what? The highest rate of unionization in this country is in public sector workers. 72% of public sector workers are unionized. Public insurance, at least in some jurisdictions, this is probably the premier location of public insurance for auto, for the things that you need every day. Emphasis on planning, as Murray mentioned, which was absolutely what happened from the 1930s to the 1970s. Creating a public service. How important is it that public policy gets designed not by political whim, but by a public service that is dedicated to go beyond the electrical cycle? And indeed, until the 1990s, this was an uncontested asset in this country. Emphasis on statistics. They mention this in the manifesto. You cannot plan if you don't measure. You cannot fix that which you cannot measure. Emphasis on statistics continues to date, but it is currently a threat. A national investment board. Well, I had a little bit of a check mark around that, because the CPP was the de facto national investment board by the time it was put into place in the 1960s, at least on the financial side of what an investment board would do. Unfortunately, we didn't have any planning to go with that National Investment Board, but it was because it was driven uniquely by provincial and municipal asks till it was securitized in the late 1990s. State-regulated wages and employment standards, check. Employment equity, check. Equal pay for work of equal value. This is the way they phrased it in the manifesto. It's beautiful. Equal reward and equal opportunity of advancement for equal service, irrespective of sex. They were feminists back then. The feminists were present, and it was in their work. A shift in public finance from sales and excise taxes to a progressive income tax system. Okay, remember, in 1933, we didn't have a lot of income taxes, and the system, whatever public finance we had, was not primarily generated from income taxes. That was revolutionized in the wake of the Depression. And it included a wealth tax, which is what they called for, which existed until the 1970s. And now we're seeing tax reform shift us back towards a more consumption model, but we still have, on the whole, a progressive tax system for raising revenues. They also called for equal taxation across Canada. Can you imagine that? Equal taxation across Canada. At the federal level, we still have that, but after all, we do have to live with the BNA. They called for fairer treatment under the criminal law because some people were getting screwed the way the laws were written, and more humane treatment of immigrants because people were getting deported left, right, and center. Well, that's at risk because of the temporary foreign work permits right now, and even with treatment and support of our citizens abroad, as we have heard to our shame repeatedly in the last year or two or three. They looked for emergency measures to deal with the economic crisis, and those emergency measures that they recommended had real legs. Electrification of rural Canada, recreational projects, housing projects, community halls, reforestation, hospitals, libraries, and schools. Went way beyond emergency. It built the platform after the Second World War. But these were the ideas generated back then. This is how you build a robust society, a robust economy. And number 26 on the list of what they accomplished through their naming what needed to be done was presenting a viable constitutional alternative to the two old, hackneyed political parties which saw very little difference between the Liberals and the Conservatives. Prevent a viable alternative for the body politic for the purposes of social reconstruction. That is an awesome list, right? They did that not because we had money. We weren't wallowing in surpluses or very much money at all. They just were clear-eyed about what needed to be done. I'm going to give you the list of what wasn't done that is in the manifesto. There's 8 items on the list. There was no socialization of the banks. There was no real national investment board in the way they envisioned it. There was no control over distribution of milk, bread, coal, and gasoline, which they called for because these were the basics that people relied on. It was interesting that housing was not in the mix. There was no system of license to regulate exports and imports, which is what they were looking for. They were looking to control trade instead of through tariffs by licensing. There was no dental care. There was no control over mining, pulp, and paper, which were the other main industries in Canada. There was no abolition of the Senate. And there was no public works financed through credit instead of debt. And they had this really interesting view that you could actually finance huge massive public investments, not by borrowing money or printing money, but by writing off credit against the assessment of the national wealth of Canada, which is kind of a out-of-the-box description. And we had a couple of almosts, too, on their list. They said they wanted to fight no more wars to make the world safe for capitalism. You could arguably say that that has been stopped. And for a time, at least as an explicit venture of the Government of Canada. And for a time, we did start demilitarizing and reducing nuclear proliferation, though that's been reduced more recently. And the second almost is a social justice system that puts emphasis on prevention and correction. And I say almost because it has occurred to some degree, but certainly not to the vision that they had. But all of this, all of the accomplishments of the folks' vision at the Regina Manifesto is potentially at risk on that list of gains. We have less control over our working hours and compensation for the majority. We have more corporate consolidation and less regulation. Farmers, again, are at risk unless they are huge-scale agribusinesses. We have greater concentration of wealth and power, more politicization of the bureaucracy, who are more tempted or ordered to serve the wants of the powerful first rather than the needs of the public. We are actually collecting less statistical information and disseminating it more poorly. We have access to fewer utilities like electricity, heat, communications, and transportation infrastructures, and declining access to free information, free community recreation, free cultural space. We have growing numbers of people without access to the basics like clean water, affordable and quality housing, nutritious food, post-secondary education, childcare, and health care. Social insurances like Medicare and employment insurance are threatened to follow the private insurance models again through experience rating, pay as you go. We have drift towards tax reforms that shift us from income to consumption basis for public revenues, and a threat to equalization and the very nature of our fiscal federalism if Ontario continues to lose ground. It is a have-not jurisdiction now for the first time since Confederation, and for the first time since we've had equalization. And with both petronations and petro-jurisdictions poised to recover very quickly once the economic downturn, the global economy picks up, and manufacturing on a long-term decline in this country, Ontario is not poised to be a have province anytime soon. That bodes very poorly for us all in our federation. The Bank of Canada role has also been vastly diminished, even though it played a very important role during this economic downturn. Because now the public and the private sector goal is to maximize credit rather than to control it or to minimize economic risk. We are again at the gate of the fear of protectionism and the very real possibility that there will be less and less fair trade around the world and with our major trading partner. And finally, instead of economic growth leading to less international tension and more fair distribution of resources, we are again at the face of war in many, many jurisdictions. And it makes you wonder, what happened to progressive politics? Where did we go? Well, that begs the question, where did progressive politics come from? And that's a matter that could fill a whole other evening of discussion. There's people in this room that could certainly better inform you than me on that topic. Suffice it to point to two things that existed in the run-up to the 1933 Manifesto. A series of movements came together to identify common cause and concrete actions that could advance that cause. And number two, the prevalence of an ethical backdrop to life based on the social gospel. Today, we progressives have no lack of ideas on how to fix things. What we lack is movement. Any movement. There's no women's movement. There's no labor movement to speak of. There's no peace movement. There's no civil rights movement. There's no anti-poverty movement. Don't get me wrong. There are many connected stakeholders and hard workers in these communities of interest. But there's no movement, no sense of purpose-filled momentum, no sense of context that connects one set of activities to another. But that doesn't mean there's no movement in today's politics. There certainly is. But it's someplace else on the political spectrum. It's a Republican movement. It's a conservative movement. And it is a movement based on practicality, emotion, and spirit. The conservative movement isn't just a neoliberal movement or even a libertarian movement. It's a populist movement. It's based on values, emotions, and grassroots organizing. It does several things vital to movement building very well and apparently very easily. It raises money. It does constant outreach, not just during elections and when they want something from you, but between elections and when they want nothing from you. It appeals to members from every demographic, every region, and it reinforces messages that make people feel like they are being heard, that their concerns and interests are being recognized and acknowledged. And it does all of this organizing with clear, consistent messages targeted on you. Not messages based on big problems or, completely manageable policy solutions. No. Their messages are emotional. They're value-laden. They're principles that draw people in like a magnet. You can improve yourself. You know best what's good for you. Governments are corrupt, aren't they? And they don't represent your interests anyway. Aren't you overstretched? Taxes are a real burden. The overarching desires that these messages tap into are freedom and choice, but make no mistake, this is a desire-based, not just value-based movement. It's not about good governance or collective interest. It's all about you. It works its magic through attraction of one person at a time, not promotion of good ideas that can help us all. And what's the relationship between movements and politics? Well, even the most politically disengaged citizen has some kind of worldview, some set of values that form a personal ideology, and that ideology is always going to be far more powerful than any loyalty to a party label. So if the goal is, as it is for the conservative movement, a more conservative country, not just a more conservative government, you best get there by building a conservative movement that really kicks it. That way, every party has to respond to the growing popularity of that ideology. They somehow have to respond to the fact that more and more people are with that. Of course, if you succeed in building such a movement, the default party is going to be the party that resonates closest to the ideologies that keep getting promoted, the conservatives. In the face of this deliberate, orchestrated organizational machine, which started back in the 1970s and has taken decades to achieve ascendance, what have progressives done? Knowing that the game for the past 30 years has been to get people to believe that government is an impediment, that destroying the tax base is a relief, and that corporations should be permitted to do whatever they want regardless of the social or economic cost because you too could get rich. That collective anything is a sham, that is all about the individual. Knowing all of that, what have progressives focused on? Policies. Public policies. The perfect list, the perfect shopping list of things that we should improve through the government. And who are progressives anyway? Well, they could well be the people who have been enticed by the conservative movement because they are being spoken to directly. Because they can see something in that vision that speaks directly to their experience, their fears, their desires. Why can't we do that? That's what the movements that came together to write the Regina Manifesto did. The delegates that came together were backed up by tens of thousands more people who were engaged, inflamed, energized with a purpose that related directly to their day-to-day lives. It was the coming together of these movements that created momentum and a sense of daring confidence that they could change things. Farmers' unions, industrial unions, the women's movement, the peace movement, settlement workers, they all came together to say, this system is failing us in so many ways. And the status quo isn't good enough. You can't embroider enough on the edges of it to do the trick. Let's completely reorganize this thing. Let's reorganize the modus operandus. And here's how we do that. Now, some people think we can't challenge the status quo today because there just aren't enough unemployed people. Well, that might be true in a province like Saskatchewan, and certainly the people that say that don't come into contact with many unemployed people anyway. Perhaps there's no need to disturb the comfortable, they say, because after all, we're all so much more comfortable. We're so much more affluent than we were in the 1930s. Surely we don't have that much to complain about. Perhaps that list of gains which came in the wake of that meeting in Regina in 1933, maybe those gains are what has made us very comfortable as a society. Do we really need to risk it all? Hardly. Poll after poll shows that irrespective of political preference or region, Canadians and Americans alike are longing for a movement that will articulate their concerns that corporations have far too much power and that the middle class is getting squeezed and there's no more juice to be gotten out of that lemon. What we need to do is to speak to people where they are and tap into the values they hold at the very same time as the conservative values that they hold. Values of fairness and pragmatism, of the shared need for sustainability and security, meaningful opportunity for each and every one of us, particularly the next generation, and the time to enjoy life, not just work. What have we learned from this recession? Well, not much. A recovery may or may not be just around the corner, but nothing fundamental has changed in the volatility of financial markets, the lack of regulation, excess compensation for some, and downward pressure on wages and benefits for the majority. In short, there is no more security, nor even a ready acknowledgement that without the government, we'd be in the soup. The Great Recession just turned into a great bailout. And in the blink of an eye, the conversation went from out-of-control investors and financial markets to pitting workers against workers who are fighting about who gets paid too much or who has got too rich of a benefit or a pension package. What happened? What have we learned? Well, what have we learned from the past? This is what the Regina Manifesto teaches us. Those with a plan get things done. Politics get pushed to the left or to the right because of movements. Movements need people. People turn to movements because of emotional appeal, because their story is reflected in their worldview, which often includes faith, belief, or ideology, not just or even primarily policies. Transformative change takes decades, and history comes in long waves. We may be on the cusp of a new wave today, and if we get organized, maybe we can hasten its advance. But fast or slow, change is coming. So where do we go to from here? Martin Luther King Jr. said, "The arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice." At least in the developed nations, our lives are without question more full of promise and potential and genuine well-being than those of our forebears 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 200 years ago. And every century does have its challenges and upheavals, and every generation has its leaders. The folks that signed the manifesto in 1933 were not only leaders, they were confidently astride that long arc of the universe towards justice. And they knew it. In part, their confidence came from something many progressives today are just not comfortable with. Their thirst for greater justice in 1933 was not just economic or social, but faith-based. Progressives today, as then, seek greater economic and social justice. Thomas MacLeod's book about Tommy Douglas was called The Road to Jerusalem. Success then and now is measured by the journey, not where we end up. What we have now is not the New Jerusalem, and we will not get there or anywhere closer to there if we're only fighting to protect what we had. Moving ahead requires some recalibrating of the way we are moving. We've got a job to do. To fill ourselves and those we've got a job to do to fill ourselves and those we wish to attract with a sense of confidence and clarity. The confidence is in our analysis that names where we're headed, and the clarity is in doable alternatives for a better way, as if it was manifest right in front of us. The challenge for progressives today is not primarily about the politically correct recipe for getting beyond recession to a broad-based recovery. No, the challenge for us today is to provide a more profound, status quo challenging analysis and tackle head-on those parts of the status quo that are going to get transformed if we don't harness them. The growing gap between rich and poor, climate change, and demographic shifts of which we have never experienced, everything is nudging us towards that new economic paradigm that Murray spoke of, the slow growth paradigm. We don't have a lived experience of dealing with our problems without growth. It's always easier to deal with things when you can count on more coming down the road rather than divvying up in a different way what you have. And a slow growth paradigm promises to usher in a wave of much more raw politics. Politics filled with very harsh and very clear trade-offs. Well, today I'm thankful to be part of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, virtually the only true progressive think tank left in the country. And I'm thankful to be in a community that was the cradle of a new politic, a politics that understood that politics are based on movements, and movements are based on engaged citizens. So I look forward to getting engaged with you as we honor our history and our future together tonight. Thanks.
The mics are open. Over there or over there. Questions or comments? Go ahead. It's on.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Two comments. I guess one is that I feel we should almost take a minute's silence as tribute to our grandparents that sort of closed ranks behind this vision and made it happen. We know that, but we're vividly reminded of it by the context you've set. But secondly, I think when you look at the legacy of the manifesto and what came into place, and the reversals that have been actively ripping it apart since, I guess, the 80s, the level of politics in which that legacy is most intact is at the community within municipal jurisdiction. And I don't think it's just coincidence that Conway and I are currently, as aging 60s activists, running for city councils. We've got the public infrastructure there with schools, libraries, agencies, and arts groups, across the spectrum. And I guess pieces of movement that come together that are able to focus and organize at a community level, whether it's around school closures, cutbacks in libraries and so on, and the defense of the role of the public sector against privatization, which in some parts of North America and certainly around the world has ripped apart municipalities more than it has here. So when we look at regenerating the movement, I think this is the level at which it can happen. I'm discouraged as an NDP activist, disappointed with the latent leadership in not connecting to the social movements, the point that Murray made. And I don't see it happening in the short term within the party, but those of us who are members of that tend to be active and connected to social movements at the community level. And I think there's the rebuilding potential is there, and the CCPA as a support group in terms of research and planning and vision can make itself felt best at this level.
Any other comments? Oh, over here.
Thanks for the...
It should be on. Yeah. You can pick it right out and hold it like you know.
I guess thank you very much for your comments, and I guess as some of us gray hairs in this room, we went through our education system a long time ago, and one of the basic questions I have, and in fact maybe it's even more appropriately put to John this evening, but why are we not hearing about this in our education system? I guess even the inkling of any of these types of social actions or events or things like that we have in this province or even in this country, we only hear about it maybe at the university level at best. And even then, it's in some cases I didn't even read the manifesto until Lynn was doing her work and stuff like that and started to get me to go back to it. I'm just wondering why it hasn't been introduced more fully into our education systems.
Wow. Claire, would you like to reply to that? We're going to have a long talk about the corporatization of education. Provincial curriculums have really fallen down all across the country in dealing with social issues and history. I mean, I'm appalled in my introductory classes how little students know coming out of grade 12, because there's been a total reduction in the hours devoted to those subjects in the core curriculum. The only time you get it really is when you get a good social studies teacher, because teachers have a degree of freedom within their class to do things. But if the teacher, him or herself, is not prepared to do that, it's not forced by the curriculum. The curriculum has really become anemic and generalized and very much oriented to here and now and the basic doctrine of trying to get the education that you need to survive and go on. And it's really not very adequate. And reform of the curriculum is something that school boards can't do. We've argued about it, we've complained and moaned and groaned. But it's a bigger issue. You really need a progressive commitment at a provincial level and the citizenship level. This is the kind of education we want. And I don't have a solution except that I would like to see the provincial curriculum rewritten and revised. But then I can hear the teachers in the room saying, oh God, not another one. Because of course the curriculum is constantly revised. And the problem is we have what is considered to be more and more content and less time to teach it. And that's a subject for another forum. Unless you have something to add.
Well, just one thing. I think that right-wing governments really understand the role of education, and when they cut education, they do it with a really clear political purpose. I mean, BC, they're cutting back again and again. In Ontario, I mean, remember the speech by the Minister of Education, Snowballen, who said, well, we have to create a useful crisis because people are actually pretty satisfied with public education. So if we want to drive more people into private schools, we have to create a crisis by cutting a few $1 billion off education, and then parents will be dissatisfied and they'll send their kids to private school. So the right is smart enough to understand that if you control curriculum, you help control what kids think when they become adults. So I think there's a political aspect of this as well.
I'll reply to your question. One, I was on the bargaining committee for the Faculty Association, and the way the universities are going is towards corporatization. The difference between teaching faculty and sessionals is an apartheid situation. It's cheap labor. Point two, the legacy of the manifesto is being ripped out of the universities by corporatization. It's instilling curriculum change, forced down. Great ideas called postmodernism, which are, quite frankly, reactionary. The great postmodernists in this world, if you study these ideas, at the turn of the first half of the 20th century, were the Italian and German fascists. The Third Reich was a postmodern society, breaking from liberalism. What's being instilled in people are the belief in social and economic justice for me, nobody else. And that's what's taking place in the university system. And the curriculum changes are going that way. I'm a bit angry because it's heavy.
Over here. Well, maybe I can make people happy. In 1935, you started off with next to nothing. And they built stuff that we still prosper with. I have a wife in a nursing home who is treated with dignity and who will die with dignity. In 1933, she would have choked her life out in the back bedroom of some slightly better off neighbor or family member. We've come a long way, and it's going to be so easy to go the next step, because if you look back at the last solid decade of the 90s, we dissipated over $800 billion in interest on government debt that didn't have to exist. We also increased tax expenditures, which is sort of a subterranean way to move money. Those two things alone would have added up to over $1 trillion, well over $1 trillion and a half in that decade. Now we've got opportunities to spend that money. We can build bloody windmills, we can build satellites that trap sunlight, turn it into electricity, beam it to Earth. We can build up our dying infrastructure. The money is there. If in 1935, when they started the charter of the central bank, if they'd added one line there, that all things of public purpose would be financed through the central bank at nominal rates of interest. And we can still go back and do that. We can do it today. The other thing to remember is the bad guys got less than 22 votes out of every 100 people who were eligible to vote when Harper got elected. Never been so easy to overturn a government. My God. Can you imagine? The NDP is down in the basement simply because they're not the NDP. So kick them in the behind, get them up there, and quit being practical and one thing and another. Let's be visionaries. Let's have some fun. God, you know, the whole thing is wide open.
Hi, I was invited to this seminar tonight. I don't know a lot about left-wing ideas because I come from a different viewpoint passed on to me by my mother and certain religious beliefs, but I got a video from the library the other day, and it really made me start to think. It was talking about shareholders of corporations. I don't know a lot about this. I just needed your help on this. Shareholders from corporations can be soulless and without conscience, because the big thing is making money. And to me, that's very unethical. And even though I come from a right-wing stance, I still was very appalled by that. There's no conscience, just want to make money, money, money. That really turned me off, that corporations would do that. So I just wondered if you could help me out to try to understand exactly what that means.
Well, I mean, corporations, in terms of corporate law, say that corporations have a fiduciary duty to their shareholders, which means the single thing other than obeying the laws, the normal laws of the land that you and I would obey, the law they have to obey is to make sure they provide the shareholders with value, and so that's what drives the system. In fact, there were two judges in the Chicago Law School. One of them, or two profs, one of them a judge, who wrote back in the mid-1980s that, in fact, corporations had a fiduciary duty to break the law if it increased profits. If they got caught, then the fine was simply a cost of doing business. So that's how far we've come. But it's interesting, if you go back into the 1850s in the U.S., not in Canada, but in the U.S., corporations were chartered a year at a time. They were not, they weren't immortal as they are now. Once you get a charter in Canada, you're immortal. But in the States, they used to actually control them. They'd say, at the end of each year, they'd say, well, are you providing a public service with your corporation. And if you weren't, they wouldn't renew their charter. In fact, I think it was in, I forget which state it was, but they closed down 6 banks because they weren't serving a public purpose. So, it's possible to imagine making corporations responsible again. But in the 150 years since that time, corporations have managed not only to change the law in their interest, but to be able to use the human rights legislation, and they get to demand freedom of speech as well. So it's a matter of turning that back and going back to where corporations were forced to be responsible.
There's more than one kind of shareholder. Do you work? But you've worked in the past, so you've got money in the Canada Pension Plan, so you're a shareholder because they turn the Canada Pension Plan into something that's driven by equities. But you don't know what they're investing on your behalf. So you're one of those soulless shareholders, even though you don't know it, right? Because you're not engaged. You're not engaged in your own investment. So even if you had no other investments, just your CPP, you are a shareholder. And there are companies like that. So there's more than one class of shareholder, but the fact is most of us are disengaged from the process of how companies make money, which is what takes the soul out of it. Because we're not, some people just want to make money no matter what, and that's their personality anyway. But huge numbers of us are involved in the market where we're not engaged in how money is getting made. It's like this black box that happens out there. And really the only way you get control over how companies make money and make it ethical, if that is your bent, or how you make democracies more responsive, is to get engaged. So I suggest you get engaged and learn more. It'll be more than just one conversation, but learn more about it. And if it bugs you, get involved. No matter what your response is, it's better that you're
really doing very much with it or changing it. And at the same time, it may play into sort of the other presentation in terms of populist thought. There's a lot of dissatisfaction out there, Foreign seems to show, with government, not necessarily wanting to reduce those services, but having that connection with citizens and whatnot. And the other one was, Anne-Marie, sort of your discussion on extra-parliamentary groups as opposed, or social movements as opposed to political parties like the NDP, and that there's being this separation, that it's kind of counterproductive. My question is actually, again, that certainly has been a problem, but if you look at, the CCF grew out of an extra parliamentary group or movement, it seemed to be better at sort of initially sort of gauging that movement and actually explaining itself, even when it had to make decisions with the caucus or whatever the party felt weren't in tune with many of the membership. There was at least some willingness to explain. That seems to move further and further away to more of a sort of a legislator's type of democracy. Do you think actually you can actually have, though, an extra parliamentary movement with that momentum that's so fluid that it is, again, part of a mass movement that's actually a political party again, or would that not be the way to go? Should these two groups be separate always to be effective, I guess? So, questions.
Well, it's sort of hard to look into the future. I think one of the things that happened in the late '60s and into the '70s was that political parties gradually became more of sort of political machines and electoral machines, and so that people who were interested in getting involved in making a better world went into social movement organizations, and I think that. That's likely to continue until some political party actually presents itself as a social movement that wants people engaged more than just coming to a convention, electing delegates, and giving money. So, I think if the NDP, and that's what the New Politics Initiative was about, was to try and convince enough people in the party that transforming itself into a movement as well as an electoral machine was actually in their interest, even in terms of getting people elected. Now, it's at this stage really hard to imagine that happening, but I think that that's still the direction that we need to go if we want some sort of really a participatory democracy. And if you look at the voter turnout now, I think the last federal election was, or the second last, was almost worse than what you get in the United States. I mean, it's around 50% of eligible voters, not necessarily registered voters, but about 50% of people who, if they registered, would be eligible to vote. And I think that clearly is in the interests of conservatism and conservative parties. So I think that we need to figure out a way of making politics relevant, and as Armine was saying, not in terms of big ideas or what we should be doing for someone else, but we have to make politics relevant for what people needs are, and those felt needs. And I think that's also the job of social movements, and I don't think they've done a very good job of that either. So we really need to rethink what it is that makes people act. And I think, as Armine said, I describe myself as an expert at telling working people that things are actually worse than they think they are. This is not a way to encourage people to get involved, but that's what we've ended up doing for the last 15 years, is sort of defensive politics, fighting rear guard, sort of trench warfare against the other side, which is always taking the initiative.
I have to weigh in, because you talked about extra-parliamentary as if it's like one brand, which is progressive. Like, extra-parliamentary movements come in all flavors, and you don't have to be a movement to affect Parliament. You can be just a really effective lobby. Witness the tax cut movement, which was bank-driven and large corporation-driven. That wasn't a people's movement. That wasn't even the conservative movement, right? It's just like really effective lobbying. So sometimes extra-parliamentary behavior is not movement-based. It's just really good lobbying. And sometimes movements are not progressive, which is what has been the case for quite a while now. So I just want to reinforce one point that I made, which is that effective movements or effective lobbies influence politics irrespective of party. Chrétien felt in 2000 he had to take up space that the Reform Party was putting out there. The reason why he put out $100 billion in tax cuts is he wanted to hang on to power, and he figured if he put out $100 billion over the next 5 years, why vote for the reform when when the incumbents are already going to do it? Like, how much more are they going to give you? 120, and then they're an unknown quantity, right? So, like, you can influence everybody's agenda if you're effective. If you do your job really well, everybody has to speak to what you're speaking to, and that's what the power of movement is. So, there's all these machinations on when do you stick with the party, when do you not stick? Like, all of that is true, and that's like everybody's going to come to their own decision differently because everybody's got a different internal political calculus. But the bigger picture is if you don't have a push from the outside, you're not creating space for anything, right? And it depends on who's pushing hardest as to what all of the political parties have to do, in particular the governing party or an effective opposition in a political process. So extra-parliamentary defines politics, frankly. Like, we've got all our eyes on party politics, but it's what's happening outside of politics and whether people are quiet or silent. I mean, one of the reasons why we've been talking about what we've been losing is because we don't really have an agenda out there on what we want to see. We just want to hang on to what we've got. The other guys, they got an agenda, get out of my way, reduce government, reduce taxes, break down the rules. Like, that's an agenda for change. We don't have something that's as quick and dirty on the progressive side. And that's what's defined politics in the last 20 years.
Yeah, an ancient military commander, and I don't remember who it was, it's been a long time since I looked at this, made the comment, I can destroy your cities, but if I leave your countryside intact, the cities will grow up again. But if I destroy your countryside and leave the cities intact, your cities will decay and crumble into dust. Centralization in this country has destroyed our countryside, and our cities are crumbling into dust. And we no longer have a farm movement. We no longer have farmers out there. We have basically a corporate agricultural entity. That is, and the countryside is basically denuded of both farmers and of people. And of the movements that are there right now, very fledgling, but it's one that could be helped and would could have a very great potential in reversing centralization, is the 100-mile diet movement. And to bring people back into the countryside and to break up that whole total centralization, bring back mom and pop stores, the whole 9 yards of things. It breaks up the whole corporate structure, and it's something that at this point in time the corporate structure I don't think would be able to handle. So it's something to think about.
The other thing I think we should do is bring back no Sunday shopping, so that people actually have time to spend with each other.
Well, Murray, I want to, propose a 10th item for your list there. And in getting to that, I first want to take two assumptions or basic premises that a lot of us have on the left and turn them on their ear. And the first is that the guys we're fighting are the guys on the right, the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, the Conservatives, the corporate executives and all that. And I want to suggest that the real enemy is not those people. Those people have always existed. They have a completely different value set than we do, and that's not wrong, which is different. The enemy is actually liberal. Small L liberal, the status quo, complacency. Just today, I heard an accountant in the city, a fairly right-wing accountant, he was talking about profit in this statement, but he says, wealth breeds complacency. And that is exactly what has happened, is we have grown wealthy and complacent. And it is actually the status quo that we have to fight against and attack. And we have to look at the golden rule. And this is the second premise that I want to turn on its ear, and that's that we're fighting against capitalism, or that capitalism is this bad thing, or corporate agendas are the bad thing. Those are just smoke screens. What we are fighting against is the golden rule. Those who have the gold make the rules. Those are the ones who have the power. And that rule has existed far longer than capitalism. It has been around for eons. It has always been those people who have the power that change the rules so that they keep the power and keep the wealth. You can look back over history at hundreds of thousands of examples, and that is what we have. And whether you want to call it capitalism or feudalism or any number of other buzzwords, it's those who have the power and wealth change the rules. They present new smoke screens so that they keep it. And so the 10th item for your list, Marie, is this: that should we happen to take power, instead of fighting about the hundreds of ways that we can do this, what we have to remember is that every single action we take has to be reallocating the wealth from those who have far more than they need to those who have far less. And if we get distracted on the little tinkerings and the window dressings and the embroidery on the edges, then we simply become liberals. Liberals are just interested in, we think we share ideas with liberals because some of our policies are similar. Because liberals You think of the old term bleeding heart liberals. They have compassion, more compassion than those on the far right do for their fellow man. But we are not just interested in compassion, we are interested in justice. So we can't get distracted by liberalism, by tinkering. We have to get serious and make sure that every single action is directed at redistribution of wealth.
I agree. I mean, I think I did talk about that a bit in terms of the tax system, right? I mean, I think I forget what year it was, but the highest marginal tax rate I think we've had was something like 80% over a certain level of income. We had something like 12 or 11 or 12 tax brackets, so that the system was much more progressive and could be again. The United States actually has an inheritance tax as well, which we used to have. So there's certainly ways of doing that.
I'm very interested in that notion of doing politics differently, particularly that is coming from the perspective of a woman, and I'm actually the newest MLA here in Saskatchewan. I'm Danielle Chartier. I'm a representative for Saskatoon Riversdale. But we haven't heard the talk around the issue of our legislature needing to look like the diversity of this province. Whether it's more women, more Aboriginal people, and more other visible minorities as well. I firmly believe that until that happens, public policy won't be reflective of the diversity of this province. But so when I'm a little nervous here. I'm a newbie politician and a newbie in front of lots of people, but I'm a mom of an 11-year-old and a nursing toddler, and people have asked me, well, how the heck can you do this? I can do this because I have a husband who's opting out of paid labor, and he's doing what women over the ages have done to support men. But my background's in work-family balance, and I think bringing work-family balance to the legislature or to politics is a really important issue. And start thinking about doing politics differently in those pragmatic, day-to-day ways. So I just am wondering your thoughts about that.
Can't happen soon enough. Yeah, I think that's great that you're doing what you're doing and that you've got a partner that supports you in the way that you're doing it. And I think you couldn't be more correct that the people that govern us are not us. You know, they are a subset of us, and they will do exactly what you were saying. They'll change the rules and make up the smoke screen so that the system works for them. And I can't remember who it was that said that the education system does the same thing. So the small practical steps are the ones that always work, and they stay. And if you can hang in there, baby, because it will require, I'm sure, a lot from you, as well as people like that. You'll be an example that a lot of people will look to. If you don't see people like yourself, you don't do it.
But has some fine work-life balance. So right in the pamphlets, and we say that Danielle will work tirelessly. And she goes, why do you have to work tirelessly? Why do you, as a politician, have to work tirelessly? Like, why is that expected of you? We talk about work-life or work-family balance. Why can't you have Sunday off? No Sunday shopping? Why can't you hang out with your family on a day? So trying to open up those dialogues that it doesn't have to suck the lifeblood out of you to do things like this. And I think we're missing out a lot of young, not just women, but my focus or emphasis is on women, but a lot of youngish, and it's not just about youth, but we notice that people with young families, it's much harder to engage in politics, especially as a mom, because generally speaking, mothers still carry the primary load for family responsibility. So I don't know how I'm going to do this. I don't know what I'm going to do, but I'm going to talk about this wherever I go. As nervous as I am, I'm sure it'll get easier in time. But I want people to start talking about that too. That how can we do things differently to engage those people who aren't engaged in politics and get them to run and put themselves out there? So that's my point. So.
I just have a question in terms of how we can get this material that's been presented tonight. Where will we find it?
I think in the book when it comes out, right?
So it won't be in printed form anywhere then, other than... Not in the paper.
Is there a Leader Post reporter here?
I could hope.
Their talks are going to become the basis of the final chapter of Lynn Goodlick's book coming out on the Regina Manifesto in, March 2010? One last question.
It's not a question,
Comment.
it's a comment. I think you make a mistake, or we make a mistake, if we think that the elected politicians make the decisions for the country. The bureaucracy, and it's in every organization, makes most of the decisions. They have the resources, they gather the facts. Most of the workers are MBAs. They've been trained in universities where they problems with the educational curriculum are the kind that you were talking about earlier, and a lot of the things they do are to reinforce their positions and their lifestyles, and they make recommendations to the elected people who say, well, you know, we can't interfere with, undermine our hirelings, so we support what they recommend. And I've seen that happen more and more in every organization that I belong to, and it happens in government. I heard both Romano and Calvert say, once we are elected, we don't need to abide by the policy of the NDP party. And that policy grows out of resolutions and so on, but they are ignored. And the politicians look more at their hired people to help them make decisions. So somehow that has got to be changed, but it's a bigger topic than we can undertake tonight.
Okay, it's about 9 o'clock. I think I was sort of told that was probably a good time to make sure we ended so people could go off and have some time off after a week of work, for those of us who have work, or for those of us who have what we laughingly call work. I'm talking about university professors. I just have to say something to our new MLA. If you pull this off, your husband is going to get more credit than any woman ever got. Anyway, thanks to our guests. One more round of applause. And thank you for coming on a Friday night, and good night.